you all know why you're here, because we are talking about the risk of collapse of industrial civilization through climate and ecological breakdown, societal stresses, and yeah, I've been really lucky to meet both of these wonderful psychologists who are also interested in this area of discussion. And so we're going to talk a little bit about where we focus, how likely is it inevitable, what should we be doing with ourselves, and so on. A little bit about me, and I'll introduce everybody. My background's in fashion, actually, and that seems a bit strange to me now. But I always worked in sort of ethics and sustainability in fashion. And I guess in 2017, maybe, I think it was, when I met my now friend Roger Hallam, and he was on hunger strike at King's College University over divestment as a PhD student. And I'd kind of been watching the science for a long time and paying attention to the environmental degradation in general in the world and in the biosphere, but also particularly through the lens of a very, very extractive and exploitative industry. And I just kind of thought, shit, that's it. Like, why isn't everyone on hunger strike, basically? So I went to a meeting with him, started campaigning on air pollution in London, did a 2-week hunger strike myself over the expansion of an airport, and then we launched XR, and it just kicked off in a way which I actually wasn't really expecting it to do. So that's it. And ever since then, I've been on a total kind of roller coaster, and I've had absolutely no money. So Jane, I met through Extinction Rebellion work, because she did some very extensive work in the past on emergency mode messaging, which has really inspired some of the work in XR and some of the way that we communicate. When I first spoke to her, she said she'd been banging on about it for almost a decade, I think you said, Jane, trying to get people to talk about the emergencies if it was really happening. So yeah. So we get on really, really well. And Jane's been semi-retired for about 6 years. She's a clinical psychologist, focusing entirely now on the climate emergency and the ecological emergency, and helped to set up Extinction Rebellion in Australia. And Aimee, I was lucky to meet more recently. And Aimee's a developmental psychologist who's worked for a decade in ethics of health and economics, including focus on mental health. And she facilitates intimate conversations. She has done a lot of work facilitating, moderating, and advocating with the Deep Adaptation Forum. So with that, I'm going to pass over to you, Jane, and you can get your slides on.
Yeah, I wanted really to do this event because I think just to get onto the Sustainable Living Festival in Melbourne, the title, Risking Collapse, is really important. And I think the same sort of battle that we had to get people to say climate emergency and later on existential threat, I think the next sort of frontier is to acknowledge that we are at least risking collapse. So I thought I'd just take you like really incredibly briefly through the bit of how I talk about it in Extinction Rebellion talks. It's probably a little bit different from some of the ways people talk about it. Okay. Before I do, I'd just like to do a very Australian thing, which is to acknowledge that where I am here, I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to express my appreciation for the care they've taken of the land through tens of thousands of years. So yeah, I suppose when I'm thinking about urgency and about message, I'm often just more talking about the point of no return, because I'm always trying to bring the message into present. Like, I think for people to act, they've got to feel there's something that's near at hand that's going to affect them. So the thing I would probably more often talk about is the point of no return, which comes before a tipping point. And I think the thing is that at the moment we don't quite know, like, whether the warming ball has already got enough momentum to keep it running down the hill regardless of anything we do, or whether it might soon. So in trying to establish that we risk collapse, I'm tending to rely on opinion, because it's very hard to prove that we're risking collapse. So one of the eminent people I rely on is Hans Schellenhuber, who says that very soon we've got to choose between taking unprecedented action or accepting it's been left too late. And the issue is the very survival of our civilisation. That's one. And the other is this Hothouse Earth paper that you've probably heard of, written by Hans Schellenhuber, but also Will Steffen and a whole lot of others. And what they're saying, broadly speaking, is that we could pass that point of no return even if we stay under 2 degrees of warming. We could pass it between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming, which is now exceedingly close. So, yeah, when I'm trying to explain, I tend to just use this waterfall 3D graph, which shows that we've destabilised the Earth's climate, and we're basically now heading for the edge of the waterfall, the planetary threshold, beyond which we just lose control of the whole situation. But if we paddle hard, if we work hard, if we take emergency action, there's some chance, by no means guaranteed, that we can stabilise it again. So I guess, in a sense, I'm kicking the collapse question can down the road a little bit. So rely on some others, which is the World Bank opinion that if we get to 4 degrees of warming, it's beyond adaptation, and also from Rockstrom that that we risk billions of deaths if we reach 4 degrees. So it's hard to prove that collapse is imminent, or it's very hard to estimate when it might happen. And so I suppose the way I tend to talk about it is in these more we might lose control of the process sort of ways. There you go, that's enough of that. So, yeah, I suppose, is that how you talk about it, Aimee?
I think it's pretty similar. I suppose we just talk about that collapse part, right? We're walking beside an abyss and we may as well look to see what's in there. Why? Because everybody that's sensible is actually already doing that. Here come a couple of Aimee slides from the deep adaptation stuff. So deep adaptation starts with the premise that maybe this is inevitable or probable, or what does that mean? If collapse happens, what happens to humans? What happens in wet bulb temperatures? Bad things. So that's where deep adaptation comes from. This idea that quite possibly, quite probably, definitely we're not going to be living exactly like this in 20 years. Yeah, whatever it does look like, it's not going to look like this. It can't, for lots of different reasons. And so if we look at that, what does it mean? Usually when people have really embraced the idea that humans and just our living on the planet has really done a lot of damage, we feel very sad, we feel guilty, we feel all sorts of things, a lot of denial that comes into it, which I'm sure all of you are aware of, and you've had conversations with people like that. But in all of those feelings, there's a chance for some agency as well. And I think it's a useful thing that when everything is changing, when everything is a flurry around you, when you look at the future and you can't use the past to predict it anymore, because that's how we've always been able to survive, right? We can use the past as a primer and a pattern maker, and then think, okay, so if it was like that, then what's it going to be like? And we can't do that anymore. And so the best thing to do with change is to do your utmost to dance with it, right? Be flexible and adaptive and flow and join in rather than trying to resist. And so deep adaptation talks about we might not fly, but we can fall with style. And what does falling with style look like in a situation when Western civilization doesn't look like it currently does? And that, I suppose, brings us to the first bit of our conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, okay. Claire's
I guess fairly nuanced differences.
Claire, we have frozen. Maybe if everyone else who's in the audience turns off their video, we might have a better connection with Claire.
I'm going to try and jump on my phone connection. 1 minute.
Oh, your bandwidth, it says. It's like that. So if we are risking collapse by keeping on doing what we're currently doing, then what do we do instead? Because, you know, I don't like the idea of risking collapse. What about you, Jane?
But look, I think one of the things we should start with is, what do we actually mean by collapse? Because I have had this conversation with Jem when he says collapse is inevitable. I mean, when I talk about collapse, you know, I'm quoting the World Bank and I'm quoting Rockstrom, and I'm quoting people who are talking about collapse as half the population dead. And, you know, goodness knows what's happened in between to get half the population dead. They've starved, or they've fought with each other, or, you know, terrible things have happened to end up by the end of the century with half of everybody dead. So I used to actually literally use a picture of Mad Max on one of my slides with the Rockstrom quote about only 4 billion survive. Because when I imagine collapse, I imagine Mad Max, or I imagine The Road, you know, one of the most depressing books I've ever read. I have a sense of talking to Jem that when he's talking about collapse, he's actually talking about something more like Greece, you know, in the GFC, you know, when money's not functioning, but the sort of farmers market, it's not like everything's broken down.
Well, I suppose in the first place, not everything will be broken down. I think I know what you mean, right? The ideas of collapse out there are really apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic. We know them. We know them from Hollywood and the blockbusters and all of the stories and the narratives society's been feeding Western civilization about how savage we are at base and how we'll always just take advantage of each other. It's a narrative that is doesn't necessarily hold out. When we look at how humans behave towards each other when there is no oppressor, they're not mean to each other in times of hardship. They look after each other. So the Mad Max, the frontiers, although I do love the Mad Max costumes, I think it's the presence of an oppressor. It's the presence of a non-loving response to difficulties that makes humans have a really hard time being nice to each other. But if we're not being oppressed, then it turns out we tend to share and be kind. So when Jem's talking about collapse, I'm talking about that loving response. Yeah, like obviously there's a survival response at the very end. Yeah, if your life is literally on the line right then and there, your body will do what it needs to do. But there's so much living to be done before that.
I think we almost need two different words then, don't we? One is where society is completely transformed into a much simpler form, but maybe with people still fine, basically, just living a simpler life. See, I wouldn't even really call that collapse. I'd call that sort of like transformation or something.
Degrowth,
yeah. The thing that worries me is where the food has run out.
So that's collapse.
And it is turning ugly.
And that's collapse.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that worries me, and which, you know, scientists are literally predicting, is the end of organised human society. So it's not farmers markets, as far as I can see. It's where you don't have the hospital, you don't have schools, you don't have police, you don't have power, you don't have roads, you don't have factories. And even if people are being as nice to each other as they can be, at that point, I think things start to turn ugly. That's my fear. And I really actually think that's what scientists are predicting, but for later in the century. And so I think the important thing, well, that's why I tend to always come just and focus on the near term, because it's really hard to predict, you know, how it will unravel. You know, you can see countries now where it's starting to unravel, South American countries where famine is actually driving people to migrate, which is fine while there's somewhere else to migrate to. But once, you know, there's famine in this country and famine in that country and famine in the next country, and there's actually nowhere to migrate to. That's the thing that worries me. But in a sense, I think almost it's like no use worrying about that, because, you know, I come from acceptance and commitment therapy. Change what you can change. You know, it's also the alcoholic's prayer, right? Change what you can change, accept what you can't change, and have the wisdom to know the difference. So the bit you can change is always in the present. What can we do in the present? And it seems to me like even if we've passed slightly the point of no return, it seems to me it's like a ball running down a hill. As the ball starts going, it has tipped, right? But if you run fast, you can still catch it. If you leave it longer, yeah. So, like, I mean, what, for example, Sir David King is saying about the Arctic is we should be really seriously thinking about trying to cool it before that ball just starts running down the hill faster. But we have the choice. But to me, I don't need to even really worry and think about the end of the century, like whether people are going to be, kind to each other or, fighting each other for food. Because the main focus for me is let's get on with, zero emissions and cooling the Arctic and anything else we can do so the whole thing doesn't unravel any more than it has to.
Yeah, it's a bit like what I was mentioning to you guys before the call. Sorry for my connection problems, by the way. That there's an English scientist, very elderly now, and he was saying to me yesterday that he believes there's no light at the end of the tunnel, but there's a duty to us to extend the tunnel, right? Because there's still young people, there's still pregnant women, there's still young families. So we have to despite the potential for this being a some people think a terminal kind of prognosis, there is a duty for us to do what we can to extend that and to improve the quality of that and to soften the space for the people that are here. And I just wonder if you've got anything you want to say about that, you good folks. I mean, I think one of the things that I was looking at over the Christmas holidays when I was doing a little bit of research was about terror management theory and this idea that people have a better response to being reminded of their own mortality if they are also reminded of gratitude. And it seems glaringly obvious that if you remind somebody that they're going to die and you also make them very grateful for life, that means you have a better response to the sort of the fact that you're a finite you have a finite length of time that you're going to be here. But it is intense, isn't it, with all of this sort of stuff in the news?
It is indeed. And I think it's interesting and important for you to mention terror management theory, because I know here in Australia, for instance, that was used to great effect with the seatbelt campaigns, where we literally watched people rocketing over a steering wheel. Or other horrific violent incidences right there on commercial television in front of everybody's faces, which did work to frightening us all into driving more safely and taking whatever means we could. Deep adaptation is not coming out to try and tell people to do stuff, right? It's just that if you read all this information about what's happening with our world and you listen to some of the linkages between things, the complexity of this house of cards, it's pretty normal to start feeling like, oh, that's very big. And so far, the governments of the world haven't been really awesome at working together, and indeed, oppositional quite a bit of the time. And so if then, what happens? And so I think it's good for me to really point out, I'm not interested in convincing anybody of anything to do with collapse, right? That's irrelevant. But do you have some feelings about how crap everything is at the moment and what that looks like in the future? If you've got young folk in your life, like me, I've got a 17-year-old, and I'm like, what's it going to be like for him when he's 25, when he's 35? Then I do look to the future. And the emotions that come along with that are the emotions of looking into an abyss. Whether or not we fall into the abyss is part up to us, right? This is the outside, the inside, Extinction Rebellion's outward now. What can we do? Deep adaptations. Whoa, inward. How do I hold this space?
I think it's Kevin Anderson who says that even with tipping points, it's not black or white. It's not like a line. Today, yesterday was in time and tomorrow it's too late. We've got this whole period where things are beginning to tip. But if we work hard, we can prevent them from tipping. Or that's what I'm thinking with what you were saying, Claire, about the tunnel. It's I don't think of it as a tunnel. I just think of it as a long sort of tip. And and I really think, even if it's beginning to tip, we've got to run after that ball and tip it back. It's not impossible, you see. I think there's white swans as well as black swans. There's things that can surprise us on the upside. So far, not many surprises on the upside. Mostly it's been surprises on the downside. But I think you never know until you try, it's looking very black. And I'm shameless about scaring people. I think we should say the scariest things that we possibly can that are true.
Right.
That we're risking these terrible, catastrophic things. And I think we need to use the power of storytelling to help people imagine what living through collapse of the milder or the more extreme form would be like for them or for their kids, right? So it's for the same intention as the seatbelts. Or I think, in some ways even a better example is the virus. If we hadn't heard the stories about the Italian doctors having to decide who to leave to die in the corridors because the ICU was full, we wouldn't have locked down like we did in Australia. Sorry, Claire, UK not so good. But in Australia, we did this whole massive lockdown. You would have said 3 weeks before it was impossible. And why? It was on the basis of a very scary story about Italian doctors. Well, of, various scary doctors. Very scary stories. I feel shameless. I want to tell the scariest stories that I can. So we start running because it's possible. It's possible to start running. I think the thing that holds people back is not even the fear of the terrible things that might happen. It's a fear that we cannot change because our political system is so broken. And again, this is where we're in a sort of worse situation probably than the UK. Like, our political system is so broken. We have so much evidence that the last climate election was swung by 80 million from a fossil fuel bill in year. I think that it's actually learned helplessness. We've been learned that we can't fix this. We've learned that we have no power. We're like those poor little is it mice or dogs anyway, like those poor little tortured animals that have had so many shocks through their feet and nowhere safe to go, that even when there's somewhere safe to go, they've given up trying, right? So yeah, learned helplessness, I think, is the thing we can counter.
I guess the thing that we've got in common, unfortunately, is a very massive influence from somebody called Rupert, who none of us probably like very much. And Extinction Rebellion is, strictly no blaming and shaming policy. But I have to say, the more that I look at the context around the world, the more I think, he has a huge, huge part to play on most continents in why we are in this situation. So yeah, between them, there are a handful of people that you really do want to scrutinise. And I think in the UK, we I guess you didn't have this at the beginning of your experience with COVID, because it does feel to me like this is potentially kind of the beginning of collapse, right? And it's quite surprising to me that experience is being found by me sort of locked in my own home. Not really able to see anyone. There's nothing on fire that we're sort of sitting around cozying with the community, or sharing things with each other or anything like that. It's like everyone was having a fight over toilet roll in the supermarket, and then you were stuck at home on your own and everyone's chronically lonely. So I think that's quite shocking for me, actually, because you have been sort of sold this imaginary, it'll be like Mad Max, or it'll be like a building coming down and something will happen and it'll be dramatic, and it's actually really fucking boring. I think, this whole slow, drawn out way of it being and I guess because of the way that we've handled COVID in this country has been so appallingly bad. It's shameful. We have the British Medical Journal wrote an article last week or the week before saying that our Prime Minister has committed social murder because of the scale of avoidable death, which has been caused through their gross negligence. And and so it's really painful, I think, being in this situation where you understand that those people in power are still there, still totally fine with all of the stuff that they've got, and a public who are sort of, I guess, kind of traumatized now. And I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you ladies, we've got a few more slides in a minute, but I'm interested in what you think about the collective kind of experience of the things that are happening, because obviously you've had those enormous fires, and that must have had a massive impact in Australia in a way which I can't which I can't understand. Do either of you want to mention anything about that?
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting how one of the problems we've got is our human brains find it so hard to even remember. So I think while we were living through the fires and there was smoke every day and everyone was, oh my God, this is terrible. And now we're having a fairly cool sort of wet sort of summer. And it's actually becoming already hard to remember. So I think that's the thing we're up against, you know, is how to bring things in and sort of keep them in people's, well, through stories in people's current experience. But I mean, the interesting thing about the fires is, because it was, you know, as you say, with the problems you've got with the media, the debate was, are these even part of the whole climate thing, or are they lit by arsonists? But I mean, the debate we should have had, and which we didn't manage to get into the media, is this the start of collapse? We emitted more carbon dioxide from our fires. If the fires had been a country, we would have been the 6th largest emitter in the whole world, right? So if it just happens once and then next year it's fine and next year it's fine and it sort of never happens again for a long time, well, okay, that's sort of awful, but it's gone, right? But if it happens this year and then not for a couple of years and then it happens again, but even worse, and then it happens again until we've actually hardly got any forests left, and then it happens in the Amazon, that's what tipping looks like. That's what the start of catastrophe looks like. And yet we didn't really get that story told. You know, we're still stuck in, oh, you know, climate change is real.
I'm really struck by, you know, that Zen Buddhist enlightenment saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, fetch water, and carry water, and after enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The implication, of course, being that it doesn't matter what happens on a day-to-day basis, we still have to find shelter, and we still have to eat, and you still have to cook dinner, and you still have to try and figure what you're going to do with the kids if they're annoying, or that there's this constancy of humanity. So even when the government has made weird decisions, like in your case, Claire, and put people at risk, there's the flurry, there's the toilet paper wars, and then there's chop wood, carry water, but by myself, like you say, not the story we're used to. Or Jane, the fires, they come through, and if you're in the area that lives with them, that's really still in your face. If you were struck by them, the funding that the government has promised has been not delivered in enough speed. So there's still people living in caravans and shanties getting food parcels. So they certainly haven't forgotten it. But for the rest of us, it's a lot like that, right? Before the fires, chop wood, carry water. After the fires, chop wood, carry water. I know this year I felt very so for the year I've been working with educational leaders and teachers and helping them cope with what has been an extraordinary change to their workplaces. And a difference in the way they see themselves. First line responders, who knew? So holding that space and doing lots of crisis therapy with people along the way, I was like, oh my God, if we have another bushfire season, I'm full to pussy's bow. I need a break. And so I've been very noticing that we're not on fire this year, and very grateful, like you say, Claire, before, right? Look at the dark and be grateful. It's like, yes, yay, we're not on fire in Victoria right here. There's bits and pieces. So yeah, I think lots of us are sitting around in these dual states of like you said, it's lonely and boring, and much harder to be apart, but in the end necessary if one wants to maintain a health system in any shape.
But yeah, I suppose I've got a really different view, because I think before emergency mode, you know, chop the wood, bring the water, and you're probably still going to have to do it afterwards as well. But there's a real lot of difference between sitting around the kitchen table, doing all those ordinary things, and then how you act once the stove is on fire, where everything else is put aside for a time. And it's the same thing we've done with the virus. You know, there's a lot of stuff we put aside because it was life and death. And I think if people realise that the fires weren't just really bad for all the communities that lived through them, but might be the start of the end. I was in a very interesting conversation with Indigenous cultural burning practitioners and people who are trying to restore the land to pre-colonial water structures. You know, in Australia, we've got so much degraded soil, like so much degraded soil and so much vegetation that's been cut down. If we moved at emergency speed and started getting the water into the soil, the vegetation restored, and thus carbon into the soil, we'd be doing massive drawdown. But there's a lot of difference between going, oh, well, it's sort of hard, so we'll do a little bit this year and a little bit next year, and then maybe in 10 years' time we'll amount to something, versus saying time has run out. And this is what one of the young Indigenous guys was saying on one of the calls. We've got to do this fast, or it's going to be so hot and so dry, there's going to be no water to work with. You can't restore watersheds when there's nothing left in the catchment. You know, when there's nothing left in the river system, you can build all the leaky weirs that you like, but you're too late. And I think even if it scares people, you've got to tell people, you've got to warn people. It's like when the fire's approaching the town. It's scary to get told you've got to evacuate, but you've got to be told.
Yep. Yep. And given a hose.
You've got to be told which way to go. You've got to be told, yeah, high threat, high efficacy, same as the seatbelt. Same as everything, every health message ever, every emergency message ever. High threat, high efficacy.
Cool. Well, I think that moves us into the next section quite nicely. So we've got some R's to talk about. Aimee's got her R's first, and then we've got one as well.
Okay, I'm just doing the Sherry business. And Zoom's got a little bit of a lag for me, so you'll have to bear with me while it lags and finds my thing. Here we go. So Deep Adaptation, Jem wrote this big, long paper. He didn't write it to try and, you know, join in the climate movement necessarily. He is a professor of sustainability and leadership, and he realised that leadership, the way it's currently understood, is bungo, and sustainability is not sustainable. And so then when he was looking around, he went through a big lit review and sort of just put it as a picture all together. Okay, so there's this thread and that thread and this thread and that thread. And if I turn that into the tapestry that it looks like, then, oh, wow, we have to do some stuff really fast to make it so that we don't just Mad Max each other. And so the stuff to do is up to you. There's no rule. I wish there was a guidebook. You know, the thing about all that terror management theory and the safety belts and the way things work in there is that they gave you a really clear set of things to do that were very obviously going to help you. So seatbelt means you don't go through the windscreen, where I know with this emergency, lots of the things that I can do are sort of irrelevant, yeah, like using less plastics. In the scope of things, individual action isn't what's going to fix that problem. That has to be fixed by industry. And so when I look, if I look to be given an individual plan, I don't really find that anywhere. I find lots of different ideas. So instead of a plan, this one is a framework, and it's a framework of 4 R words. And the first one is resilience. So it's a framework with which to think about. So if collapse is likely or probable, let's say, then what do you want? If it was 20 years from now and you're in the future and everything is different and harder, how do you want to be? What things do you definitely want to keep around? What behaviors do you want to make sure that you are engendering? How do you want to be with people, with country, with animals? What needs to stay that we've got now that is actually worth holding on to in our ways of being? And I know there's a beautiful book Jonathan Lear wrote, Radical Hope. He talks about Plenty Coup and the move of that Native American tribe onto the reservations. And at the time, well, these moves onto reservations looked like it was the end of everything, but that what Plenty Coup did when he led his tribe in was he kept them quite alive with this idea of radical hope. He didn't call it that then, Lear did in his book. But this idea of radical hope says, I'm blind to the future. You know, in other countries, the words for past and present are about where you look. We talk about looking forward to the past. Other countries talk about looking to the past and being blind to the future, because really you are blind to the future. And so this idea, welcoming that, we are blind to the future, we will act as if. We'll act as if there's more for us later on. We will keep on maintaining the ways that we do things and our own ideals, even though everybody else is saying this is coming to an end. And that idea of radical hope is one of the resilience ideas, and there's heaps of others. Then relinquishment is the next one. So 4 R's, first one's resilience, the next one's relinquishment. What do you need to give up? What behaviours do you need to give up? What beliefs do you need to give up? You know, decolonizing fits in here, some consumerism fits in here. Growth, 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 progress, ever onwards, upwards. What do we need to let go of? If we don't let go of them, what happens to what we're doing now? So an example of a relinquishment idea is the managed retreat principles that are actually being carried out by pretty much all countries around the world that can afford to do it. Yeah, Indonesia is a prime example, moving their capital all the way out of somewhere that's going to flood more to somewhere that will flood less. Yeah, America doing the same. So we don't necessarily see managed retreat in a huge way there. We see shoring up of water lines. But if we are to relinquish the area beside the sea, where then do we live? How then do we live? I wish that worked for me. Restoration is the third R. Resilience, relinquishment, restoration. What do we bring back? What do I need to know how to do? Because if stuff gets a bit trickier, then it would be useful if I know how to do it. What modes have ever used and worked before? What modes have we used that have worked before? And of course, our beautiful example there is all of history, where humans in the face of deprivation are incredibly resourceful and incredibly adaptive and really go a long way to having innovative uses from extant products or extant things. So scrap heaps, salvage heaps, what you've already got that's broken. Restoration comes through that sort of way. And then in some maybe ways, like for instance, we're not separate from this world. Human exceptionalism is dangerous. Let's restore a sense of being together in this world. We belong like everything else does, but that gives us a primer on how we need to be. So how do we do that? And there's a little host of ideas here. They're going to be different for every person in every country and every setting. Obviously, people in cities are going to have a hard time growing large amounts of foods. I think cities are going to have a really hard time unless they're very communal. Hey, if we can rewild, like Jane says, at the speed of light, rewild and rewater and reconnect our land and our ways of living on it and with it. What do we eat? How do we eat it? Who gets to graze where? Who gets to do what where? And then some activities. How do you restore yourself inside of all of this? What is it that helps you stand tall, stand strong? Yeah, that's different for everyone. Today I went on a tree climbing course. I went on a tree climbing course. It was fantastic. It's very restorative. It reminds me how strong my animal body is and what it can do when I trust it. Then the fourth R, reconciliation. What do we need to come to terms with? Do you need to reconcile with people in your life? Do we need to reconcile with others? Is there such a thing as other? I'm not sure that there should be, but clearly we do a lot of othering at the moment. So how do we reconcile those sorts of things? How do we connect? How do we love? How do we find the ways to each other and to all of the connections? And so these are some of those ways, yeah, grief and forgiveness and gratitude. Savoring through suffering, with suffering, not in spite of, but because of. We savor because we suffer. Compassion, stories that we tell ourselves are like super powerful, right? Humans working together do awesome things. That is a story we need to be hearing more of. Yeah. Decolonizing, justice for all, making sure that there's equity and fairness as we move through these next phases, which is not what we've seen through COVID at all. And then Joanna Macy, and I can't say his name, I'm sorry, but Hans, Art of Living, and his beautiful words. They're great places to start with reconciliation. Jane, over to you.
Okay. Before I start sharing the screen, I'd just like to say one of the things I do like about Deep Adaptation is, and I've just been reading this book, which is, I don't know if it's the right way around for you, but anyway, it's called How Everything Can Collapse. It's Pacific and Stevens. And it's always annoyed the hell out of me, actually, when people talked about adaptation, because it seems to me part of this sort of myth that, oh, well, it's going to be a few more hot days, but we'll get more air conditioning. Whereas what Jem is talking about is things like have a plan for how you shut down your nuclear power stations. What it's got in this book is that just shutting down a nuclear power station can take years. And even now, we haven't got that many people who know how to do it. So if you're going to be serious about adaptation, take seriously, like, do it properly. Be serious about the fact that the whole thing, the whole pack of cards could fall over, right? And preferably don't build nuclear power plants, but if you're going to build them, have a really serious plan about how you're going to shut them down. If you're going to build a desal plant, don't build it where the sea level is going to be up over it in a few years' time. So yeah, and it's that idea of bringing the image of what collapse could look like into the present, so you don't do really dumb stuff that's not going to survive a bay collapse and certainly not going to survive a big collapse. Anyway, moving on to Extinction Rebellion's R. We've only got one R, one main R for rebellion, because I think everything that Aimee's saying I really agree with and I really support. And I would love to, and I think a lot of them actually are part of Extinction Rebellion. We've got to do all that stuff. We've got to practice all the new forms of decision making. We've got to practice being patient with people that are irritating. We've got to practice surviving long Zoom meetings and making good decisions. We've got to practice sharing with our neighbours. We've got to practice not having our whole self-esteem resting on our fashion statements. We've got to practice all that, but none of it's going to be getting us to where our kids have a decent life unless we rebel. And I'm not going to, I think a lot of you are Extinction Rebellion people, so I won't go through it. But basically, I think it's actually the only moral choice at this point, because our governments are behaving unethically. The same as the governments who failed to act on the virus. It's exactly the same, except even bigger. So, yeah, when the rules don't work, in history, there's been civil disobedience, and it's resolved that stuckness. It's very powerful, even in Gandhi against the British. Quite amazing. So I think we mustn't give up hope. We try and do everything that we can. And surprisingly, of course, it turns out that non-violence is even more powerful than violence. So that's sort of nice, because we can do all the things that Aimee's talking about in terms of creating the better world from inside our movement. But I think I still put that R for rebellion as number one. I think unless we do that, then it's going to be pretty shaky.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, so we've sort of discussed just before this call that this is kind of looking at two sides of the same coin, or some things that are, I don't know, interwoven. And I guess for me, I think something quite seriously different about XR when we launched it was this like permission to grieve. And aside from understanding, I think, largely from others' research. So I was lucky that I met people who started XR with me, because a lot of the very clever research was done by other people. But the sense that we had to moralize this issue so that people could really understand what it means spiritually to be living, like, facing this actual reality that we're in, and the seriousness of it, and the lack of kind of serious discourse around it at the time. And I think that a lot of people, I've spoken to lots of people who've said, you know, people know deep down that where we're at is not okay, and the systems that we have are not all right, and they've not been all right for a very long time, the way that they've treated the world and the way that people have been treated through them. And so it was really that sort of connection to the emotion, and I think that's why there's such fine kind of bedfellows in a way, Extinction Rebellion and Deep Adaptation, although they're asking you variously to sort of do some nuanced different things, right? And but there's so much overlap. So I don't know, Aimee, if you want to talk anything about the two things, how do you think they coexist, the outward rebellion and the inward? Maybe it's an inward rebellion too, right, in some ways.
I think that you're right, there's this coexistence, and my mind is being drawn to this idea that part of the story that we're told at the moment is that everything's hierarchical and it all has to be ranked. Something has to be first, something has to be most important. And I would say part of the deep adaptation framework is encouraging simultaneity. Yeah, these are not ranked. There is no one thing that is better to do than any of the other things. That's like ranking emotions, like whatever. You can try if you like, but you're going to find it changes all the time depending on what's going on for you. So they're all simultaneously important things to have an awareness of and operate in however you can. And not in a prescriptive way, but they tend to be the things that we come to. Reconnection is the other one, which Jem and I talk about inside reconciliation, but I know other people want to have another hour of reconnection. People like coming up with, the label that matches the thing that's resonating for them. They're all labels for the same resonance. Things are rough and likely very poor. What do you do then? Right? That's the natural reaction when you actually swallow that, you take that red pill, as they call it. It's like, well, then what do I do then? And depending on your coping mechanisms, the way that you operate usually in life, if you're a knowledge seeker, you'll go out reading heaps. And if you're a person that connects to people and goes and tries to make a group, then off you'll go and you'll do that with great success, Claire. Right? We all are going to retreat to our own methods, and somewhere in the XR's Rebellion and the Deep Adaptations 4, or however many R's you want to have, a framework of looking at stuff, it's all there to wander through or to be illuminated by or to act as a part of.
Yeah, I guess I've got a bit of a different perspective because feelings arise, all sorts of feelings. My work used to be with people who were self-harming with a history of trauma, and for them always all sorts of strong emotions were arising, right, because of triggers, right, that brought into the present the horror of the past. And I think it's very important, this thing of accepting emotion, and not trying to control it, because you basically can't. So as emotion arises, but what we used to say was make space for it, but don't decide what to do based on what you feel. Keep your eye on the lighthouse. Keep your eye on on your values, on the things that you want to be remembered for in your life, the things that are most important to you, which for pretty much everybody is basically looking after people, having good relationships with people, and doing good in the world. So I don't actually think all action is equal. I think doing good in the world at this point in history means saving as many lives as possible. There's people already dying, like lots and lots and lots of people. If we could see them, our hearts would be breaking, but they're not in the news. We can hardly see them. We hardly know about them. But I feel a real obligation based on my values to think very hard about what is the most effective thing I can do to save lives. And that's where I think, Jem Bendel's and the Deep Adaptation message that we're risking collapse, is so important, because I think it clarifies that moral question. And look, I don't think it goes against anything you're saying about other important tasks. But to me, it's always a bit like when you're in a war, there's things that change when it's life and death. Or, when there's a flood, there's things that change. And sometimes you just have to be a bit rough and ready and get that person out of the river. Sometimes you have to spend a relatively short time grieving your friends that just died and keep on fighting. And I think it's more, we're in an emergency. I think we've got to keep our focus very much on what is the next action we can take to save lives, because it really is life and death. Yeah, that'll do.
Thanks, Jane. Well, I'm going to just move us on shortly to some questions. So if the guests want to ask any questions, if you can prepare them, put them in the chat box and start sending them through. I've got a note here that the thing we were going to just talk about before the Q&A was ways of coping. And so maybe we could just have a couple of minutes on that. I guess, you know, one of the criticisms that I read from Jem quite some time ago was about, you know, how some people would cope by just launching into like being extremely busy all the time, not really taking the time to deal with what's going on. And I think I'm potentially guilty of that, but it's definitely, for me personally, I've always been like that. You know, ever since the sort of experiences of childhood trauma, I was very much brought up in the sort of, okay, carry on, go to school, keep going to school, or you've just been to a funeral, go back to school, you know. And for me, that's always been, I've sort of carried that habit through my life, you know, that when something's difficult, I do have a tendency to work extremely hard. But at the same time, as that can be difficult, I think it's the catharsis in the rebellion is an absolutely fantastic way to feel liberated. And I'm due on a panel this evening to talk about doing civil disobedience and nonviolent action. And it's kind of it's a spiritual engagement, I think. And I'm not a religious person, but I find it very interesting that I'm often in a room surrounded by people of all different faiths talking about the spiritual nature of being in this resistance. And I find it more and more and more sort of like personally enriching for my soul, really, to sort of know that I'm connecting with this kind of work. So I don't know if you want to say anything about your guys' coping experiences and how that's going for you. Jane?
Oh, yeah, well, it's obvious how I cope. No, it's not. But again, like one of the things we used to say with when I was just working as a therapist was do everything you can in the moment and then let go of the result. And it's sort of, I don't know, it sounds sort of obvious, but it's actually still quite hard to do. Like I was going to work one day and I'd missed the tram stop, so I was sailing past and I was just about to, to be late basically. But there was nothing I could do to stop the tram. So it's no use going, you do everything you can. All I was going to be able to do was get off at the next stop. So that's a sort of trivial example, but, we do spend a lot of time going about things we actually can't change. But if we've done everything that we can, then if we happen to win on this, we'll be all at the victory party going, hey, weren't we cool? If it all turns to shit, we'll be going, well, I can rest easy. I did everything that I could. I don't have to have regrets. That's why I left work. Much as I liked my work, I didn't want to have regrets and feel like I could have done more. But I've, within the limits of not completely burning myself out, I'm doing everything I can. So I'm going to have no regrets. Like I won't necessarily be happy with what's unfolding, but I'm going to have no regrets. And that just gives me, I don't know, it helps me feel okay.
Over to you, Aimee.
All right. Okay. So coping, lots of different ways of coping. Hey, and I reckon I don't even reckon, I know in emergency situations, in disaster situations, people's brains choose the thing they are most familiar with and they use that to cope, whatever it is, right? So for me, it's reaching out and connecting with people and being all lovey and like helping other people have their feelings in ways that don't hurt other people. So that's clearly what I've been doing for the past while. And also I've always been a fairly frank person, so I'm fine to talk about things other people don't necessarily want to talk about. And so then that is a thing to make sure to keep doing, right? Because if there's lots of people that don't want to talk, then talking is useful. But everybody's going to have their own passel of ways to cope. I think it's really important, though, for most of us, that there is some action, and something collective that's going on, so that you do it with other people. And you literally physically do something, like love is a verb, it's a doing word. It's not just a sitting around talking about your feelings and wallowing in them. It's a doing thing. And so any kind of loving response naturally involves actions, and usually they're other focused actions. So ones that are not just about me, but they're about how can I do for everybody else. And, we all know this. If we all looked after everybody else, everything would be much nicer. So coping in that way. I suppose the other one is, sometimes if you need to numb. If you need to distract, distract. If you need to dance, dance. If you need to have a long shower, have a long shower. If you need to camp for 3 weeks in the bush, do that. Don't choose one thing and stick to it, I would say. Mix it up, your coping skills. And if you're finding that something that you're relying on to cope is starting to make it hard for you to do any kind of acting in your own life, then it's a sign your coping skills are a bit out of hand. Yeah, and I think that's the risk when we look at a future, and some people maybe feel pessimistic or hopeless. I don't, because I can't see the future. I couldn't see this coming or last year or anything else like that, right? So I don't necessarily feel hopeless. But if you were to, then you do need to find a way of sitting with that. And the best antidote for hopelessness is doing something.
Thanks, Aimee. I completely agree. And I guess it sort of also takes me back to the, you know, that time when I first met Roger and got involved in like working on campaigns and testing different tactics. And in the UK, sometimes I feel something that's hard for people in XR to hold on to is the sort of the intentional, iterative nature of the work, and experimenting with different things and just seeing what happens, right? And there was something joyful for me about feeling the kind of feeling the support of a small number of people to encourage me to take these kind of great big risks with my own freedom and push some boundaries and stand in the road and see what happens and go and spray paint a building and see what happens. And that, I think, being in a state of like learning as well is really like helping me, that the idea that we're sort of learning as we go and we're trying things out and we go, oh, how interesting that happened. All right, I wonder what happens if we do it like this, and then go and do it a little bit differently and see what comes back to you. So something very playful, I think, about the sort of origins of XR and the sort of mischief, I guess, the goodness of the mischief that it is, that I find it really like helpful, actually. So let's go to the questions, because I've got some here. This is really common thing, I think, Brad. Your wage earning job feels really meaningless in the context of an unraveling world, and this brings a lot of frustration, I guess. I know lots of people in the UK who feel like that, and I sort of personally, I shocked myself recently by saying I was an ex-fashion designer, because it made me realize that I've given that up and I don't think I'm going back anytime soon. And it's strange for me because it was such a big sort of, I guess it's like a major part of my identity. I worked towards it since I was a small child, and I said, I want to be a fashion designer. And then I did it. And now I've sort of put it all in the bin. And it feels very strange in a way. But have either of you, Jane or Aimee, got any comments about how to cope with that feeling of having to work in something that feels fucking pointless, I guess, is how I hear it from
Brad, because Brad's going to come and work with us. We're just going to raise the money so he doesn't have to do his bloody job anymore. I think we need the people who want to work on the rebellion and can to come and work on the rebellion. We've got to get it organised in Australia so we can give them enough money to live. And the people who need to keep working for various other reasons, they need to give money so that the people like Brad can come and work full time in at the office and do good stuff. Brad's fantastic. We should let him speak. I'm just talking about him. But yeah, Brad's one of our total hero rebels, and we need him full time, not trying to have to do a day job. But yeah, I think like that frustration, it's a sign. It's a sign that you need to move, you know. But no one can live. You can't live on air, you know. You've got to have something coming in. And we just got to get this sorted out. That's my opinion.
We see a lot of people coming through the Deep Adaptation Forum with similar concerns. That's the Facebook group that there is, yeah. It's like, oh my God, I'm doing this soul-sucking job, but there's actually better things to do. And some of the stuff that I see coming up there is people, and I know this was relevant for me as well, and Jem, and probably you as well, Claire, yeah. People inspect, what is the job I'm doing? And then is this aligned with anything that if I look back at doing that job, is that aligned still with the who that I hope that I will have been? Is my job in alignment, and sometimes it will be and sometimes it won't be. Now, not everybody can just change their jobs, not by a long shot, and that's certainly not, you know, if we project forward into the future, that will probably get harder too. So sometimes you will end up in a job that is part of the problem. Yeah. And I think it's really important to be able to compartmentalize yourself from your work at that point in time, because like you said, Jane, you can't live on air. You do actually have to do stuff. But if you can get your job more aligned so that at the very least you're working for something that isn't contributing to the damage, then that is something that I've seen participants choose to do on purpose. Yeah. So it's obviously a level of privilege to suggest being able just to stop work or quit and wait for another one to come up or whatever else. And that is definitely not everybody's path. So if you can and you want to, then totally, please. Yeah. And for everybody else, it is about where are your values, and then how well can you boundary off? And then when you look at the money that you get in, what are you using your money for? And not just donations, right? But what are you using it for your own path through this?
Yeah, I guess one thing I find quite scary is that I don't own any property. I don't have any savings. I don't have a pension. I've put myself in a very, very precarious situation, and it's interesting, isn't it? I don't know if you have this in Australia. I guess you probably have some similar sort of conversations around the left, but certainly it's quite a left thing about privilege, and whether or not people are using it well has always been sort of something that we've talked about in the team that launched XR. And it's quite used to sort of shame people in this country, to say, oh, you would do that because you've got privilege, and I'm interested in how people sort of cope then with the aftermath of that, because here in the UK we've had a lot of experiences of the left kind of fighting itself, let's say, which is quite I think it's a worldwide phenomenon, isn't it? But okay, let's go to Mark, because I think this is also a really interesting thing to talk about. So Mark says going to start doing a fortnightly climate information table at a local market in a moderately conservative area, and asking if there's any feedback. So I'll say quickly what we thought about before we launched XR in terms of speaking to Conservatives, which I think is very simple. It was to say, if you are politically left, you have a reason to be in opposition to what's happening for very obvious reasons. But if you're more to the right or you're more conservative politically, then you might believe in security of the economy, you might believe in people's right to own property, people's right to protect their own livelihoods, and all of those things that are more conservative values have give you perfectly good reason to completely oppose this the onset of this multitude of crises. So that's one thing that I think is quite useful to bring to Conservative audience, that they've actually got quite a lot of values that make it ideal for them to join in this with us. And I don't know if you've used the sort of beyond politics label in Australia, but I think it's been much misunderstood in the UK actually. And really it was a call to ourselves and to everyone else to go somewhere beyond politics, and to recognise the crisis as something which exists beyond the realms of any politics. But people have quite often said, oh, it's you, XR, you think you're beyond politics yourselves. And they get very frustrated, the people that want you to say, we're socialists, or we're this, or we're anarchists. So I think it's useful to kind of explain that the vision is a coming together, right, across political divides and across polarity. And actually, a lot of Conservative people, I think, can be interested in that. But do you want to speak to that, Jane or Aimee?
Just really briefly, I think actually everyone's values are the same. Like, everyone cares about survival for their kids and basically a good world for people, and everybody wants to do good in the world. I think it's the problem we've often got is that Conservatives have read too much of the Murdoch press. They don't realise how serious it is. But the other thing, I think my partner used to teach sales. He says, if you ask questions, the person will sell the thing themselves. If you try and tell them, they'll just fight you. So I think actually, whether you're dealing with a Conservative or whoever you're dealing with, you're better off asking them, well, how serious do you think it is? How did you come to that conclusion? What if it was worse? Would that change your view? I think you're always better off to ask a question than to try and give a lecture.
I'd agree with that one wholeheartedly. Mark, I would say the other day David Attenborough popped on television and went, "We're all screwed." I don't know if you all saw that, but he's talking repeatedly now. David doesn't seem to be particularly concerned about how much he scares people. He's just getting out there and using his platform and his voice to say, "Hey, wake up!" And so I would say don't be too worried about scaring people, but if you want to make sure that you can scare them and hold them safely, then collective efficacy, a belief in collective efficacy, is what holds people safe. And Jem's just done, we've just done a literature review. It's worth popping into the group and having a look, or onto his blog and having a look at that lit review, because it's about specifically discussing these sort of ideas with people and what works and what doesn't, and is it useful or is it not. So there's some stuff in there. But yeah, go. Well done, you.
And look, the other thing I forgot to say, but I think, sometimes people say, oh, I tried this message with this Conservative, it didn't work. I think the most important thing with any message is that it comes from a trusted messenger. And I can remember once handing out to politicians going into state parliament, and this woman was sort of shying away from me. And I said, but I've never seen what I'm handing out. She said, I can tell already I don't agree with you. I was in my best Conservative clothes too, but anyway, obviously wasn't passing muster.
Can I add one more thing here too? For the Conservatives in Australia, I'm just going to link this in the chat box now. This is from the Department of Home Affairs, so Dutton's own department. And this is the vulnerability and how we deal with it document. And so for anybody who's a dyed-in-the-wool Liberal, you can say, also the Liberals are really interested in this and they're doing lots of planning. And in here, for instance, is the structure for a 2-day workshop to do with workplaces, to introduce them to the idea that humans might go extinct soon and everything's fucked. And please, can we do something about it? What does it look like in your organisation? So I think it's telling that the government itself is actively doing what I would like for them to be doing, but just quietly. And so if you're coming up against people who say, oh, no, it's nothing, well, our actual, Liberal government does think that there is something going on as well. So there's a place in there, I suppose, to reassure Conservatives that their Conservative politicians are actually already in that space. It's just not flooded through the media necessarily. And I think that's a useful sort of thing. It's a very useful document if anybody's got an organisation.
Thank you, Aimee. Yeah, somebody recently in the UK drew my attention to a very interesting statement from our Prime Minister, who's a Conservative person, which was that climate change is going to increase the likelihood and the frequency of war. And this is a message that we had led with some months before. It caused quite a stir because of the way that we did. Some people did quite a controversial action, but for sure it felt like news that was a statement from him. And lots of people in our government sort of seem to start to say that. And I guess what we've also had recently is, as you might have seen on Gem's blog, Ministry of Defence in the UK, saying that we're headed for 3 to 4 degrees, and that's the conditions that the military need to prepare to work in, and their equipment needs to work in those scenarios. And it's very unpredictable. And here's, some of the stuff. So if this is the stuff that's being released to the public, then I'd really dread to think what's in classified documents in our sort of ministries in this country. But that does speak somehow to you can really speak to a Conservative audience, I think, about wanting to mitigate harm in specific ways, and particularly in that way. I don't know if you think that that's like quite a sort of quite a useful, scary story to tell, Yeah,
before the virus got hold, we had actually a David Spratt talk on on climate as a threat multiplier for war and breakdown, which we were going to tour around some of the conservative electorates. You know, we must try it again. Because I mean, the irony is that the Defence Forces have accepted long before a lot of the environmental NGOs that it was an emergency. That they've been doing scenario planning back, you know, since 2010. They know it's an emergency because they deal with climate breakdown in all its forms. Anyway, I can see some other interesting questions. I'm worrying we've got 12 minutes to go. We should whip through some more.
Yeah, sure. So Sue says, shouldn't XR focus on the regions where there is deforestation happening and political conservatism and lethargy?
Well, I mean, part of the theory of change of Extinction Rebellion is based on the idea that you only need to have somewhere between 1% and 3% on the streets. So I think we probably I think we've got two tasks. We've got to focus on the low-hanging fruit and get the numbers, just shutting down the city, because I think Roger Hallen is right, that the most powerful thing we can do is cause basically economic disruption and pain in the cities. And that's what one declaration of emergency in the UK, 11 days of disruption in London. On the other hand, I think as part of winning, we've got to actually also show that we can appeal. Like, same as Lock the Gate. Like, they didn't get thousands of farmers that were prepared to come to town, but the day that 10 farmers were going to come to town and ride up Burke Street towards the State Parliament in Victoria was the day that the government declared a moratorium on fracking. So I think you do need to engage those more conservative audiences, and also sort of like the untouchable audiences. Like, nobody wants to arrest farmers, no one wants to arrest kids, and no one wants to arrest old people, basically. There's probably a few others as well, but farmers are right up there. So I think if you can get even a handful of farmers that will come to the city and help you shut down the city, that's really powerful. But I think the thing that Extinction Rebellion says, just in terms of tactics, is it's too late. The time has run out to go and stop Adani, stop this gas field, save this forest, run all over the country, trying to operate and organise in those really remote locations. We just got to bring everybody to the city and shut it down for as long as we can and hope we win. So it's a different theory of change.
Yeah, so you're really advocating for civil disobedience. I was seeing your question, Sue. Is civil disobedience still the way to go, given the shift in social acceptance of the climate change situation now? And I guess for me, the answer is still yes, even though we've done quite a lot of civil disobedience here in the UK. I think there's something really powerful about seeing those people sort of wearing their professions. We've had a huge success actually with having scientists in lab coats. The police do not want to arrest rabbis, priests, scientists, teachers. There's all kinds of professions that you can sort of ask people to performatively kind of bring to the streets. And it makes for a very interesting kind of like interaction on the ground. It has like a huge kind of emotional impact, I think. What do you think about civil disobedience, given the climate change situation is sort of more broadly accepted? So, or maybe it's not in Australia. Maybe your context is really different to mine.
Talking to you the other night on the phone, I think we're in a completely different stage. I mean, Claire was saying to me on the phone that even the sort of right-wing or the most extreme press in the UK is sort of doing all this greenwashing. You know, the right-wing press in Australia is still saying warming is good for us and that sort of stuff. Like, we've still got straight-out climate lies happening. So I think even though the idea that you know, climate change is real is sort of gaining acceptance, and even though I think we've got 64% now who agree, if you put it to them, that it's an emergency, how many people on the street are really just freaking out and willing to do whatever it takes because they think it's an emergency worse than the virus? So, you know, I don't think we're within cooey of that. And I think we've got to keep going. And I think part of the thing about civil disobedience is that it shows that you think it's really serious, that you're willing to take a risk.
It does, and doing it non-violently is of the utmost importance, so much so that there need to be marshals around making sure nobody gets violent, because I've seen so many of them. There's some seeds of some groups who have different ideas about how we should be doing these things, and their ideas aren't necessarily non-violent, and they seed violence inside those sorts of civil disobedience times, and then it makes everybody else look like that's what we're here for. Not here for that. So non-violence upheld, yeah, Gandhi-esque, it is, and letting the government know that yes, they're doing stuff, yes, they're thinking about it, it's not enough. It's not enough. It needs to be more. It needs to be in a hurry. It needs to be much more tightly focused, and they have to stop looking after the mining magnates and the oil magnates and the media magnates. They have to.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the non-violence thing for me is quite important. And again, like on a kind of spiritual level somehow, I think, because the way in which we engage with this work is I think, as you were saying, like about about being blind to the future, Aimee, I guess, like, you know, if you don't know what you're going into, but you want to do it in the right way because you want to sort of lay the right ground. And something that I think people in the UK have talked about less than I hoped that they would, because it was embedded in the original talk, but it was this like rise of the far right, the potential for the reemergence of fascism, the fact that fascist politics finds it very easy to thrive in times of great fear and scarcity, and that looks for sure like a place where we could end up. And this is, I think, the non-violence for me is also kind of preemptively quite firmly anti that, and that feels really important. We've got some messages in here. Hold on. Sue Robertson says 150 people turned up in Bellingham to hear about the emergency threat of imminent logging. The mood was high for actions to halt loggers in the coming weeks. There was an invitation.
I was talking about low-hanging fruit in the city, but I mean, that's low-hanging fruit in the country. Like I'm not sort of obviously saying that we should ignore areas where there's a spontaneous sort of uprising, or not spontaneous, but, you know, where there is already activism building. Yeah, we need to help those people, protect those forests. If there's people working on it, of course we do, but also bring them to the city to shut down the city.
Yeah, there's some communicators, people researching climate communications, who've been saying recently that one of the things that the climate movement needs to learn to do is to respond quickly when something major happens. So, you know, really to have your stuff all prepped and have everything lined up and be ready to go, so that if there's an extreme weather event or something climate related in terms of local or a national sort of big news event, when you've got that hook, when you've got the people talking about it, that you can move straight into that space. So I don't know, Jane, if that's if you want to say anything about that, about being, I guess it's like about being prepared, right?
Look, I just think we've got a general direction, which is basically gather as many people in and cause as much disruption and tell everyone that we're risking collapse, because that's the next thing we've got to say, as well as emergency. And the great thing about Extinction Rebellion, but it's also the sort of forms of communication I think that Aimee is talking about, is that we're flexible. You know, we can do. We had a massive die-in in Burke Street, which partly was accidentally organised by somebody who'd come along and enthusiastically put an event up and didn't organise anything. We did it in a week. You know, there's big NGOs that won't do it, you know, unless it's you know, you've got 3 months or 6 months preparation. So, yeah, I think it's a combination of sort of dedication and people knowing that it's really, really serious and being sort of willing and ready to act. And then it's a matter of seize the moment. You just never know when the opportunity is going to open up. I mean, the stuff happening in Australia right now with soil carbon, where even the nationals are sort of starting to say that, you know, maybe farmers should be doing something different. Yeah, I think these things just, like, the landscape keeps changing. And the great thing about Extinction Rebellion and the movement of the 99% of people you see, because I think there's a broader movement which is just about the 99% just saying, look, we're sick of not having control over things, you know, that we're the people. Yeah, so I think that movement of the people if it's organised with self-organising systems and good communication, flexibility, leader full, we can just boom, we can just move. We can move in a week.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing to me that's important from the UK perspective, my experience, is that whilst I think it's important that people feel prepared and that we're ready for things that happen that are relevant, that we need to jump on, particularly for the news cycle, there's also something magical about how we've gone on the front foot with XR and planned to our own schedule. And you put a date in the diary and that's it. We're going out and we're going to do this work. And there's something about doing that work proactively that creates a space in a way which doesn't exist unless you go and make it, and the dilemma that you create when you do those big actions, which opens space that doesn't exist before you take those actions in a quite an interesting and profound way. So I'm just noticing the time, and Jane, I think you've got maybe a closing slide or two to move into the final remarks.
All right. There we go. Taking values at face action with others feels good. We need courage, not hope. If not me, who? And it's very sad to hear about the 250 people who didn't take action in that forest situation, but we have to take action. So hold back if you feel like doing it. We're having a rebellion around Australia around about March 22nd. In Melbourne, it's going from the 22nd to the 28th, and there's the website. So I'm not shy just about saying, join us. I think it makes a difference. Cool. You know, I still think we can win, but I have been called a pathological optimist before.
There are many worse things to be called, I think, Jane, probably. Do you have a final slide, Aimee, or do you want to just speak to the links that you've shared?
Yeah, I do. So I've put the link to the main Deep Adaptation website there, and that's got all of our bounce offs into the various offerings that there are. The second link is the main Deep Adaptation group. That's the international one. The third link is the Australia, New Zealand Facebook group that I am the admin and moderator of, but I'm looking for somebody else who wants to step in and do it, as we always are in volunteer organizations, right? So yeah, join in the conversation, whatever it is. It certainly is big and wide and people all around the place, and you're welcome.
Oh, thanks, love. Yeah, and I think that's important. XR has been trying really hard to make sure that people feel welcome, right? Because it's rather strange times and we need to go places where we feel welcomed. And I might never make it to Australia now, given the situation and my criminal record. But I think it's the people that I've met in XR groups around the world are so phenomenally brilliant. Just when I've visited briefly some other places in Europe, and I walk into a space and it's the most welcome, you know, despite facing these very, very difficult truths and talking about some very bleak things, it's so welcoming. So yeah, thank you very much all. It's really been a pleasure to come here and talk to you guys.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much everybody for your kind attention.
Thanks you guys. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and thanks Claire for getting up so early in the morning.
Thanks, Claire.